Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I actually found it a very useful exercise to really think about how science contributes to animal welfare standards. And still in my mind, I still have some concerns, and perhaps you can help me today in terms of alleviating some of those. Okay, so I'm addressing this topic of, does science provide a factual basis for rational decision making? Lynn's introduction was a very useful one, and it saves me covering some of the ground that she has covered. So the structure of my presentation is a little bit of background on the development of animal welfare science. I think it's useful to think about where animal welfare science came from. It's a relatively new discipline, and I think that's useful to think about, and to think about where we've come from and where we are today. Spend some time talking about welfare assessment, because welfare assessment is quite a challenging topic. I mean, animal welfare is really a social issue, and so it's a bit difficult, I think, at times to really clearly define what animal welfare is. And if you can't define it, it's damn difficult to study. How do individuals decide on what is acceptable? I think it's worthwhile just having a quick look at that to think about some of the challenges that exist for individuals, let alone policy makers that are making decisions around what is acceptable or not. The application of science, how we use science in establishing standards, and this is where I think I'd like some feedback. And then finally, the question, does science provide a basis for rational decision making? I think it does, but there's a few qualifications. So the background. Animal welfare science really emerged as an interdisciplinary field of research, and it is interdisciplinary. It emerged in about the 1970s. It initially involved basically animal behaviour and stress physiology to try to assess animal welfare, but other fields were quickly recognised and have been utilised in the assessment of animal welfare. So it's a relatively new field of endeavour. It was all probably stimulated. There's been several factors that have stimulated our interest in animal welfare, but in recent terms, Ruth Harrison's book on animal machines, back in 1964, stimulated considerable discussion within the industrialised countries around intensive animal production systems. And that debate still continues today, I would suggest. In her book, she raised three concerns, and I think these concerns are still quite prominent today. Animal suffering, the unnaturalness of the confinement production system, and that's often a concern that the general public has about some of our production systems. And the exploitation of animals as an inherent feature of these industrialised production systems. So that stimulated considerable discussion. As a consequence, the British government established an eminent committee under the leadership of Professor Bramble to report back on this issue of intensive animal production. Bramble's committee defined animal welfare as a wide term that embraces both the physical and the mental well-being of the animal. They also made the recommendation that research should be undertaken using the available science to try to evaluate the feelings of animals. So they recognised at that stage that really animal welfare is all about feelings, how individuals feel. And their assessment, or they suggest the assessment of feelings, should be based on the structure, functions and behaviour of the animal. They also recommended a range of disciplines, particularly animal behaviour, but also physiology, veterinary medicine, environmental physiology, etc., that are required to evaluate or to assess animal welfare. So let's think a little bit about welfare assessment. The everyday meaning of animal welfare, as Lynn mentioned, is refers to really quality of life. And a simplistic definition, similar to what Brambles was suggesting, is how an animal feels. Science today would consider that animal welfare is a state within the animal. And there's very good consensus within science on that definition. And that definition provides us with a scientific perspective, which in turn provides the methodologies that we can use to assess animal welfare. And there are basically three conceptual frameworks that scientists use to assess animal welfare. Now, there's considerable overlap between these conceptual frameworks, but it's useful to have a look at these fairly quickly. The first one is often referred to as biological functioning, and the concept basically equates poor welfare with difficult or inadequate adaptation. So, how well the animal is performing from a biological function reflects the individual's welfare. The methodologies that are used to assess how well the animal has adapted are methodologies that utilise measures of a range, long-lasting range of behavioural and neuroendocrine responses together with fitness effects. So if we're seeing substantial behavioural and physiological change, there is likely to be fitness consequences. So it's a broad examination of the biological fitness of the animal. Biological functioning of the animal. The second conceptual framework is what's often called the affective states framework. And it basically emphasises that animal welfare of an animal derives from the animal's capacity to experience emotions. Assessing emotions are difficult, and scientists in the past have, and currently, have basically used animal preference studies to assess animal welfare on the basis that those preferences reflect emotions. So animals will be attracted to things that are rewarding, and animals will avoid things that are punishing. So a range of preference tests have been developed. Simple preference tests using Y-maze or T-maze tests. Aversion learning studies, measuring the aversion of animals to particular situations. As well as motivation testing, trying to assess the motivation of the animal to assess, a particular resource or to perform a particular behaviour. Or conversely, to avoid a particular resource or to avoid performing a particular behaviour. These two concepts of biological functioning and affective states in the past were viewed to some extent as being competing. But there's recognition that there is considerable overlap in these conceptual frameworks. There is evidence, for example, that animals that are deprived of things that they highly prefer to access or behaviours that they highly prefer to perform, deprivation of those resources or behaviours leads to biological dysfunction, will lead to examples of animals having difficulty adapting to their environment. The third concept is the one involving natural living, and this conceptual framework promotes the principle that an animal's welfare will be better or good when it can express its normal behaviour. For some people, this implies animals being raised in natural environments and behaving, obviously, in a natural way. That concept requires more enunciation because we know that there are considerable hardships in a natural setting. There are features of a natural setting that place an animal's welfare at risk. So it does require some definition in terms of what aspects of the natural environment or what aspects of natural behaviour we should try to facilitate in order to improve animal welfare. More recently, there's been a focus on discussion around an environment that suits an animal's natural behaviour as well as other adaptations. So the idea of adapting to the environment has actually been incorporated in this refocusing of this concept. So they're the three concepts that scientists have used. Those three concepts give us the methodology to assess animal welfare. These three concepts or conceptual frameworks draw on many disciplines, similar to what Brambles' committee originally proposed: behavioural science, immunology, neurophysiology, psychology, stress physiology, and veterinary science. As I said before, there's increasing appreciation that there is overlap between these three conceptual frameworks, that there is a relatedness between these three conceptual frameworks, and I think there's an appreciation that it's an understanding of these three frameworks that should assist us in managing and improving animal welfare. Let's just quickly look at how individuals decide on what is an acceptable or unacceptable animal use. There are a number of interrelated factors, and let's just quickly look at those. The first one is the individual's attitude to the animal in question. And an individual's attitude to the animal in question appears to depend on two dimensions. The affective component, so the sort of emotional response that the animal evokes in the individual. So, for example, how individuals may view a pest animal versus a domestic animal. So that affective component is quite an important component that influences an individual's attitude to the animal. The other aspect is the utility of the animal. What the animal may mean to the individual. What the animal may mean to the individual in terms of an economic value or perhaps a physical, mental health value, if we're talking about, for example, companion animals. So that's quite an important determinant of how people may view whether or not a particular practice is acceptable. And perhaps that's an example of why perhaps there is variation between individuals in when we think about what may be humane vertebrate pest control, for example. So that attitude of the individual to the animal influences how people view whether or not an animal practice is acceptable or not. The other aspect is the individual's moral obligation to the animal. So there may be a range of moral principles that the individual adheres to. Those moral principles might reflect, for example, a utilitarian or an equal consideration view to the animal. It may reflect an animal rights view. It may reflect a virtue ethical view. For example, as you do to the animal, you will be repaid in some shape or form. So if you treat your companion animal well, the animal's likely to show unconditional affection towards you. So there could be a range of ethical views that influence whether or not you consider a particular practice acceptable or not. And of course, there are broader harms and benefits beyond the animal that we might consider. And indeed, modern animal ethics is more than just consideration of the animal involved. It considers a broader range of harms and benefits. There may be some philosophical views, such as just a preference for keeping animals in a more natural setting, not on a basis of any welfare concerns, but just on a philosophical concern. And of course, religious and cultural beliefs may influence an individual's particular view on an animal use. And of course, what science may tell us about the impact on the animal. And that's the role of science. Science can tell us about the biological impact on the animal. So it's clear when we think about decisions at the individual level that there are a range of considerations. Let's look at how we may apply science in terms of developing animal welfare standards. This French physicist, Henri Poincaré, or Curry, had a very interesting view on the interaction between ethics and science. And he was talking about application of science in general. And he suggested it's a two-part process. Ethical decisions are made to determine the goal that we want. And then science teaches us how to attain that. And I think this is a useful view in appreciating how government or industry generally decides on animal welfare standards. And indeed, David Fraser from the University of British Columbia has argued further along the lines that when animal welfare standards are established, there is this two-part process. The first is a policy decision, and it often involves political and ethical considerations, so that comes into the mix of what animal goals one would pursue. It's often tacit rather than explicit. And so the goal may be housing animals in a system that involves high levels of survival and reasonable productivity, right through to a system that involves the opportunities, for example, for animals to experience positive emotions. So that's the first step in the process, developing this policy decision. The second step is to use scientific research to identify the specific requirements to meet this goal. So that's the technical aspect. I'm not certain if it's a sequential process like that. It's probably a much more interactive process, and particularly when you look at the process here in Australia, it is probably more of an interactive process where there is review and refinement or adjustments to the political process based on the scientific knowledge. But I think it is a general model that we use when trying to establish animal welfare standards. I mean, if we take the situation of tail docking in piglets, pain's involved in tail docking. But the pain involved in tail docking is probably markedly less than the pain involved in tail biting in pigs. And science is involved in terms of, okay, if we're going to minimise pain, if we're going to try to minimise pain to a particular level, what's the process that we use? Now, the process may involve tail docking, at least in the short term, and that is a common procedure, until we can understand what are the factors influencing tail biting in pigs. And it's a very complex topic. There's a whole range of factors that affect tail biting in pigs. It's multifactorial, and it occurs in most of our production systems. Systems on concrete with slatted floors, systems in deep litter, systems where there's variation in space allowance, systems where there's variation in ventilation, systems where there's variation in food delivery. Let's just look at so-called Fraser's model or proposal in terms of this two-step process, and considering that it may not be sequential. The United Egg Producers of the US decided, anyone from the poultry industry? No, okay. Yes, when did they come out with their standards? Oh, okay, sorry, yeah, I used it, okay. It's probably about a decade ago, maybe a little bit less, that they decided that 432 to 550 square centimetres of floor space per bird was their policy. And they decided on that because it provides sufficient space to prevent crowding-related reductions in survival and production. So that was one of their goals. But they weren't going to provide sufficient space for natural behaviours such as nesting and perching. So that was their policy decision. That policy decision was based on science in terms of looking at what were the consequences of 432 to 550 square centimetres of floor space on bird survival and high productivity. Whoops, did I jump past one? Oh, okay, I've deleted the slide. Okay, I'll just describe that slide to you. About the same time, the European Union decided to require cages, standard cages, so-called battery cages, to be replaced by furnished cages. And they decided on furnished cages on the basis that hens should be able to carry out some key elements of their natural behaviour. And in particular, they identified nesting behaviour, dust bathing and perching. So that was their policy. And furnished cages had been developed about in the late 70s, early 80s, and they had been developed specifically to provide laying hens with the opportunity to perch, the opportunity for laying hens to lay their eggs in a nest box, and the opportunities for laying hens to dust bathe. So you can see that a policy decision's been made around the welfare goal, and then science has provided the technical information in order to achieve that. Perhaps we can talk about sow stalls, with the decision of industry to phase out sow stalls during gestation by 2017. Now that decision was probably driven more by animal welfare standards that were developed in the private domain, for example, coals and other elements in the private domain. NGO activities such as Animals Australia and Voiceless in their campaigns against sow stalls, perhaps international developments, and industry decided to phase out gestation stalls in order to, and the replacement system was group housing of sows. So science is involved in perhaps developing that the welfare goal that the policy makers decide on. Science is also involved in actually making that policy work. So for example, with sow stalls, the challenges for animals in those systems is the aggression that occurs particularly after mixing. So moving from sow stalls to group housing systems, and it's often the case with many housing systems, when we replace one housing system with another, we often just change the nature of the welfare problem. So with group housing systems, there are challenges in terms of sow welfare, and science is busy at this point of time in trying to identify the technical aspects of reducing sow aggression, reducing stress, and improving productivity and survival. So I'm almost there, Mick. I'm floundering around a little bit, but I'm getting there. So there is a place, there's an important place for science in developing animal welfare standards, but there are policy decisions that are made that involve other considerations. Oh, there it is. My goodness, there's the EU slide. I'm sorry. I am floundering around here. So, I think, my answer to the question is yes. Science has a role in rational decision making. Science brings to the table an understanding of the impact on the biology of the animal. But biological facts alone are not sufficient for resolving the question of whether or not a particular animal use is or is not acceptable. It's an ethical decision. And I suppose the other issue that we face is that there's various levels of welfare quality or welfare standards. And that is a major consideration. What level of welfare standard are we trying to achieve? In order to get rational decision making, there needs to be broad consensus around the policy decision. And I agree that animal welfare, the community has a substantial stake in animal welfare. It's a social issue. So all of the stakeholders need to be represented in those broad discussions. And science is one of those stakeholders. I often think that if we're going to get rational development, there are four key considerations. Research on the impact of the practice on the welfare of the animal. Research on the attitudes of the community, because we haven't got a good handle on community attitudes to welfare issues. We haven't. But the only area in the world is probably the EU with the Eurobarometer, where they regularly survey the public's attitudes to animal welfare issues, where they're monitoring changes in values, community values in relation to animal welfare. Having an understanding of public attitudes, as well as consumer attitudes obviously, but public attitudes is really important, and I think it's important in terms of moderating the extremes in some of the debate. It's very important to understand what the public's current attitudes to the various animal uses is. So research on the impact of the use on the animal, research on public attitudes to that particular use, public education, and that's the thing we do very, very poorly. I mean, the public are not brought along in some of these discussions about the impacts that we might have of a particular animal use when we're establishing animal welfare standards. And of course, industry education. And the final point is this broad consultation in developing the policy. Fairly obvious things, but I don't think we do those things well. And just finally, it's the last slide, I promise. Now, we recognise that there are drivers for welfare change in both the public and private domains. So, and we recognise that there is this disconnect at times between the official welfare standards and those developed in the private sector. Quite a substantial disconnect. In fact, the OIE, the International Animal Health Organisation that has responsibility for establishing welfare standards internationally, is having several reviews into this particular disconnect. Some also suggest that while change driven from the private domain may be more responsive to community or consumer concerns, as compared to official standards, government standards on animal welfare, the public standards on animal welfare, some have questioned how well these private standards are grounded in science. Thank you.